Welcome, guys, to your new unit on taxation and fiscal policy. This is going to roughly be a unit over chapters 14 and 15, I think, in your textbook, where we delve into a rather unpopular issue on the level of taxation in the country and what it's designed to do for us. But before you can start to look at fiscal policy, which is the government's basic taxing and spending program to affect economic change, you have to understand how taxes are classified, how they're structured, and what impacts they have on the economy. So I'll be getting to my notes here in just a second. A couple of announcements moving forward now that we've had a chance to acclimate to the new distance learning format, guys. I'm going to be reducing the number of assignments that you have to make this work a little bit more easily for you, I hope. You can expect now per class about 2 to 3 online assignments, short little quizzes or crosswords or guided readings that you can do fairly easily, okay? So I hope that's going to make you feel better about the time you're spending on ECON. It's my goal to get you everything you need to be successful on that test, and that's what I'll continue to do. So without further ado, we're going to go now to the PowerPoint for today. I'm going to get rid of my face box here and kind of annotate or narrate for you what you need to know. It kind of corroborates what the previous video was talking about, how we structure these and what they're designed essentially to do. So think of this as kind of like the basics of taxation, okay? In talking about criteria for taxes, I want you to be familiar with a few vocab terms here. When we talk about equity, again, we're really talking about fairness. And that's something that we take into account when we think about criteria for taxation. We really want to be fair across all different walks of society as we put these things in place to raise revenue for the government. Simplicity, tax codes in place need to be easily understood. This probably would be the one area we'd criticize the current tax system, specifically the income tax, because it's a really challenging document to understand. It's about a 4-inch binder that comes out every single year, and it basically creates the need for someone to go through that tax code for you and understand it so that you don't inadvertently cause something bad to happen with your federal taxes for the year. But simplicity simply means that we're going to be able to understand when we're taxed, what will be taxed, and have certainty moving forward about what that revenue is for. Efficiency simply means is the tax going to raise the revenue that's necessary, or is it something that's going to create a lot of really bad side effects, like putting businesses out of work, or creating black markets where people try to get around paying the government tax. So there are a lot of things to consider when those tax codes go into place, and sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. The fourth thing that I'm going to add to your notes today is certainty. People really appreciate knowing when and how and what will affect their livelihood and well-being. When there's an uncertainty in the markets, you see what we're seeing right now. Stock markets, wildly vary, up one day, down the next. Business owners don't know whether they can hire and fund more labor. So it really is helpful if we know what the tax code is and what the expectations are before we begin to make those really big decisions. So this slide then summarizes all the 4 criteria for taxes. You'll see them again in the homework. So feel free to use your notes here as you answer those questions for homework tonight. Figuring out who pays has been a long-running discussion here in the United States, and we've been having discussions about inequality. This is something that helps ameliorate that. So let's start by looking at the benefits principle. The idea is that if you benefit from a revenue or a service that's provided by government through taxes, then you should have a hand in paying for them. That would be known as the benefits principle. Here in Texas, we fund Texas road repair by putting a tax on gasoline. The thinking is, if that person's driving, then they're probably causing the damage to the roads, so they therefore should have a hand in paying for them. So that basically justifies putting a tax on gasoline. If you're doing the driving, then you should have a hand in paying for the road repair. The ability to pay principle is the second principle we consider when levying a tax, and it basically is a fairness principle. We don't want to burden parts of society unnecessarily because we know 70% of all economic activity comes from consumption. So, this is the argument probably that backs up the federal income tax, which is a progressive system where the more you make, the more you pay. Being able to spread around the burden of that tax or the incidence of the tax makes it possible for the economy to thrive and still create the revenue that's needed for federal government. So, these are principles that you'll need to be familiar with. Taxes in the economy, whenever we put a new tax into play, we have to consider that like a price change, right? And prices change behavior as they rise or fall. In some situations, taxes have the ability to provide resource allocation, where people will simply divert their resources around a new tax or price increase. That may also have the power to change consumption, and sometimes they create unintended consequences. So, behavior adjustments. Some taxes do have the power to change the way people behave in their daily lives. If I asked you whether or not, though, a new increase in taxes on speeding would change your behavior, some of you would say yes, and some of you would say no. So the effect of taxes to do this is somewhat debatable, depending on the nature of a case by case analysis. So. Productivity and growth. Typically, when we see increases in taxation, we see a slowdown in business and output. That's what has led your governors and your federal officials to lower taxes and to decrease taxes to encourage additional spending. So think of taxes as kind of like pumping the brakes and slowing down the economic activity in that circular flow model, while lowering taxes tends to typically speed things up, provided they're actually spent on labor and people or materials and not going to, featherbed the pockets of the wealthy. So these basically give you an idea of what taxes, what impact taxes will have on the broader economy. Now let's see if we can understand how to classify them. To make it very, very simple, I want you to understand that the classification of taxes in the U.S. is one that's based solely on comparing income levels. So you always have to have different income levels in order to figure out how that tax is actually affecting the pocketbook. When you do that, you're going to get three different kinds of taxes. A progressive tax is the more you make, the more you pay. And the example that I have here for you is the federal income tax. Proportional taxes, otherwise known as flat taxes, charge the same percentage on all kinds of income. There are very few to point to. Medicare may be one example, but beyond that, there just aren't that many that we can kind of use as an example here. But most of our taxes in the U.S. fall under the regressive tax category, where it may look like it's proportional on the surface, like a sales tax. But ultimately, it's going to take a larger chunk out of a poor person's pocketbook. So this is going to require a little bit more analysis for us to see. Use these three different kinds of taxes, progressive, proportional, and regressive, as you try to classify the taxes that you're going to see in your homework tonight. Let me see if I can give you a visual example here. Let's start with the easiest one on the surface, the proportional tax here. I have a person's income of $200,000 on the left, of $20,000 on the right, and a dollar amount of a tax on the bottom of your screen. Now, immediately you would be saying, probably this feels more like a progressive tax, where the higher income is being taxed more dollar amount, right? If you do the fraction test, though, we find out that this is actually 15% of a total person's income in tax, regardless of their income level. So this is kind of the example that I like to give of a proportional tax. Again, the examples that we have, there's not that many beyond Medicare, which is a tax that we pay through withholding on our income taxes, right? It's part of FICA, the Federal Insurance Contribution Act, which basically allows that withholding to be done before we spend the balance of our paycheck on something else. So there really isn't a whole lot to point to. I guess when I was in high school, where you guys are now, there was discussion of a flat tax to kind of replace the federal income tax, but the House and Senate were just as divided as they are now, and the idea really never got off the floor. Your homework next class features a cartoon where there's a guy arguing for a flat tax. So you'll see that phrase again, but just know there isn't any flat tax in place right now in American taxation policy. Okay. So the Medicare is the only example that I really can give you of this. But if we take a look at the next kind of tax, a regressive tax, this would also on the surface level seem like it's taxing the richer person more. But when you do the fraction test here and compare the dollar amount of the tax to that person's income, you're going to see that there's a larger wedge on the right here at 20% of total income in taxes. On the left, you only see a wedge of about 10%. And that seems just kind of inherently unfair, right? Unfortunately, that's how most of our taxes are set up. If you look at state and local sales taxes, you'll want to make a note essentially for the sales tax that you pay, about 6% of that goes to the state of Texas. The remainder stays in your city of Southlake, but they fund state and local government through that very important tax. If you're talking Social Security, driver's license fees, tickets, fines, court fees, anything that basically raises revenue for the state can be called a tax. They are set up to be pretty much regressive, even though that doesn't seem inherently fair. So we have to use a special word here, de facto form of a regressive tax. It's not like the government set out to target the middle and lower income classes. It's just that, as a matter of fact, this is the way they affect our pocketbook or checkbook. And that has to be taken into consideration when we think of something as big as the income tax. So looking at this progressive tax situation, we're talking primarily about the income tax. Here you see different dollar amounts, and what you're going to see is a higher tax bracket on the left than you see on the right. And that's roughly where our tax brackets fall, with the lowest being around, say, 14%, the highest being around that 25, 22% range. So if we're looking here, I wanted to show you the current federal income tax brackets. What happens here is that your income is carved up into pieces or parts. And whenever we're talking about the part that goes into the next bracket, your income is taxed at a higher level. So this is basically to offset the progressive taxes or the regressive taxes that we're seeing everyone else pay, whether it be sales taxes on purchases or driver's license fees that we all have to pay. This is to kind of level the playing field and make sure that we're all carrying the same burden or a fair share of the burden. When you look at how that works for taxable income of $50,000, you guys can see that the tax rate changes through each of those income steps. So it's kind of a misnomer to say that you're paying 24% or 25% of your income in the form of a tax. Only a portion of your income is being taxed at that high rate. When we consider the corporate taxes are also set up this way, I just want to debunk the myth that corporate taxes are just ridiculous in the United States. The corporate tax rate has dropped significantly from where we were mid 20th century. So you got to realize that if they're not charging corporations taxes, then they're likely to get that income or revenue from individuals. So that's a bit disconcerting, considering that U.S. corporate profits have increased over the same time period. So in terms of examples of taxes, guys, just take a quick look at where the tax revenue comes from. You can see that right now it's either going to be the payroll tax, which is Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare, or it's going to be the income tax. So by and large, you guys can see production taxes like the excise tax have decreased. Corporate taxes there in the green have also decreased. And unfortunately, the federal revenue bill still has to be paid. And that's where they come to. They come to you, the taxpayer, to get the balance of the bill. So to sum up here, types of progressive taxes, the only ones I can point to, the federal income tax, State income taxes, if present, not here in the state of Texas, and the federal corporate income tax. That is basically it. Okay. So here's a test hint. When it's time to classify those taxes, you realize that most taxes are naturally regressive, that only a few that you know of are progressive. So 9 times out of 10, your answer is going to be a regressive tax, and that should help you on that section of the test. Okay. All right, so here's a little pop quiz. In the last couple of presidential elections, taxation has been talked about, and there was this one candidate years ago who thought he had a real solution to the plan for fixing our tax system. His plan was called 999. And this was Herman Cain. He was arguing for a 9% income tax, a 9% corporate tax, and a 9% national sales tax. And it seemed to be kind of catching on, right? Catching on with a lot of people because they could remember it. Sounded like it was going to be a decrease in a lot of taxation for people. Tax brackets would disappear and everybody would have a fair hand in paying their taxes, right? Well, I'm hoping that you can see this was a dramatic shift of tax burden down to the middle and lower classes, because that 9% sales tax is going to be added to existing sales taxes. So in reality, you and I are going to be paying like 17 or 18% in form of a sales tax to recoup the losses from that decrease in the 9% income tax. This corporate income tax being reset to 9% also would put additional burden on the income that you and I earn. So after we kind of figured out what was happening here, we realized this wasn't the best idea for American taxation, and this guy didn't get the nomination. So this is kind of how taxation is discussed in the U.S. You rarely find people looking at the total or marginal average tax rate we all pay. Most people will focus to exclusively on the income tax. So don't fall into that like gotcha category here. Look at literally how the taxes are going to hit your pocketbook, and be wary of those catchy phrases and tunes that don't really add up when you look at them in further analysis. All right. One last idea here. This is a problematic vocab term that we usually see on the vocab quiz as well as the test, the incidence of a tax. What we're talking about as economists is the burden of a tax. So be sure you're aware of that. The burden of a tax is somewhat determined on the elasticity of demand for different kinds of products. If you have an item that has an elastic demand, you can expect the burden of a new tax to be shared between the buyer and the seller. That means that you'll see a little bit eaten by the buyer of a new car, and then some of that paid by the buyer of a new car, right? For inelastic demand, most of that burden is going to get passed right on to the consumer. The consumer is likely to buy no matter the price, then it makes sense that the seller would be more likely to pass that off on the buyer. So just keep that in mind, that incidence of a tax is actually the burden that we're talking about. All right. So that wraps up the PowerPoint notes. You guys have them there as a download. They are complete. If you want to print them off, you're more than welcome to do that and use them on the homework tonight, or you can just come back to the video here and then consult your notes. But that will do it for your discussion on taxes today. So thanks, guys, for tuning in. I hope your homework goes better tonight. I will see you back here on the Canvas website a little bit later.